Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Atherotalk podcast, brought to you by the EAS Young Fellows. I'm Pelin Golfrush from the Hatter Cardiovascular Institute at UCL in London, and I'm truly excited to host this episode. Today we have the privilege of speaking with Professor Ruth Fricke-Schmidt, a leading figure in the fields of lipid metabolism and cardiovascular disease. She is currently a professor at the Department of Clinical Medicine at the University of Copenhagen and chief physician at Rigshospitalet in Copenhagen. She has made tremendous contributions to cardiovascular research. Professor Fricke-Schmidt has held key positions within the EAS, including chair of the EAS Award Committee and the Scientific Program Committee for the 2020 Congress, and has contributed to the organization of EAS advanced courses. Professor Fricke-Schmidt has had an impressive career, including serving as the chair of the Scandinavian Society for Atherosclerosis Research and working with large-scale cohort studies in Copenhagen and abroad. Among these, the Copenhagen Baby Heart Study and the Copenhagen General Population Study and the Copenhagen Hospital Biobank. Her research has shed light on how lipid metabolism changes in early childhood and how it impacts not only cardiovascular diseases, but also neurodegenerative disorders such as dementia. Professor Fricke-Schmidt, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today, and I'd like to thank you on the behalf of the EAS Young Fellows for joining us. Let's begin by getting to know you a little better, both personally and professionally. To start off, could you tell our listeners about yourself? Who is Ruth Fricke-Schmidt?
First of all, thank you very much, Pelin, and the Young Fellows for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I've been looking very much forward to it. So who am I? Professionally, I went to medical school. During medical school, I very quickly engaged in research, which was, of course, mind-blowing for me. Just after medical school, clinical basic training, and continuing to do research because that was very important for me. Back to doing a PhD, postdoctoral training abroad, back and forth, and then going into specialist training in clinical biochemistry. That is a specialty where the bridging between clinical duties and research is very, very much in focus, and that meant a lot to me. Then a very important milestone for me was after the last part of my specialist training, I got a big grant from the National Scientific Foundation, the Independent Fund Denmark. And that was a major grant of €1 million to establish and consolidate my group, expanded. I had begun, of course, to have my own students. And that was very important because you also got the chance, I got the chance to develop my field. So that was professionally, and you could say it's actually also personally. I'm so happy to be married to my life companion. Now I think we go for the 34th year.
Yes.
And we have our daughter Sarah, who works for the Foreign Ministry. And she has a Master of Science in Environmental Development and mostly works abroad. And then our son, he is doing education as a film and TV production technician. It's very important for me to be close to them, not only my close family, but indeed also my kind of extended family. And then being very close to a bunch of friends, not many, but they are close, those that we have had for many years. That makes me cope in my professional life also.
That's a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. Could you walk us through what an average day looks like for you? How do you manage the various demands of research, clinical work, and leadership roles?
Thank you so much for that question, because that got me thinking. So an average day is very difficult to define. But if I look at a bit from above, you could say my average day in my kind of seniority here is that it's a mixture. It's a mixture of department duty meetings and department duties and research meetings individually with students and postdocs and also in groups, of course, with research projects and external collaborators. And this can sound, of course, a bit confusing, but it is really what fuels me, energizes me, because this close connection between the everyday clinic, serving the big university hospital, highly specialized functions, to serve the clinicians in making the right choices with what we do in our clinical blood test services at various levels, that is fueling my scientific thinking and the way back. So a typical day, I would say, is a mixture of these different aspects of clinical science and clinical duties, I would say. And then, of course, also mixed with university duties, teaching and academic tasks in various ways.
That is something I'm sure many early career researchers can relate to, finding that balance between multiple roles. Do you have any advice for those starting to juggle such responsibilities? How did you navigate the transition from a researcher to someone with significant leadership roles, both within the university and beyond?
Very important question. If I had the answer to that, I mean, I would be extremely relaxed. I'm sure this is what is important, to find the balance. And can we ever find the balance when we are scientists, together with being clinicians or diagnostic persons? In periods, we find the balance, and in other periods, we don't. And I think that's a premise. Because when you are a scientist, I'm sure we all can agree on that. We are in it because we cannot not be it. We are there because it's our sincere interest and our urge. And when you have such an urge and you are dedicated, it's of course always a danger that you don't find the balance and there is a danger of burning out. We all know that. But how can you help yourself, and how can you within your group and as a leader, or perhaps as a senior scientist, a postdoc, how can you be more aware of this so you see the signals, the danger signals among the young ones, and perhaps also above yourself? How can you do that? And there are tools. So my advice here would definitely be that you at least after your PhD, in your PhD, of course, your mentor is aware of this and should do an expectation alignment. So you're aware of the signals and prevent that burnout signals are happening. But as a more senior, younger scientist, I think the advice should be that being very aware of leading up, leading to the sides, and of course, leading yourself. There's a lot you can do. And I think the tools that I've found, probably too late, that are relatively clear for me now, is that even though you can have a very messy day, messy week, and so on, in your head, say to yourself one thing at a time. And of course, that's naive, because never there is one thing at a time, but you can use it as a tool for yourself, and also talk with your students about it, that fine, of course, we know we have a long list to do, but let's say prioritize and what is the most important thing right now. I also supervise several young scientists who also are in clinical training, that perhaps on the way to gather money for a full PhD, or after their PhD, and they want to continue doing research, well aware that there are some patients out there that they need to treat first. But how do you cope with that? Because I, as a senior scientist, I'm not aware of their everyday duties and so on. So how do we align our expectations there? It's very important to be aligned. So that's an advice for younger scientists as they progress in their scientific and clinical careers, to be very aware of that, because you can prevent burning out, and you can increase the success of good collaborations when you are aligned. We are all aware of that sometimes there are deadlines that are extremely important, and you have to throw all you can away to do that. But it's the more we talk about it and align, I think we can prevent and also get the best research projects, but also career paths for people at various levels. And last, and another thing with respect to balance and expectations or alignment of expectations is really privately. Because we all know if you get family or also if you are single or do not have kids, I mean, it's so important to talk privately about my next week is really important and a lot of workload due to those and those reasons. And we all know that if your partner or your children knows that, of course not small children, but if you take the time to align in your family and among your friends also, everybody of course, understands what is going on, that this is important for you. So I think that has not been, a deliberate choice that I did when I was 25 and 24 and met my husband, but it has come to me as a natural thing during my career. And he has done the same. So keep the conversation going in the family on what is important for you in your working life. I think that can prevent a lot of discussions and crises, emerging crises. So yeah, that's an advice.
I think that's a really important topic, actually, and your insights are really valuable for us. Now that we know a bit about your day-to-day, let's dive into your academic journey. What initially drew you to study lipid metabolism, atherosclerosis, and cardiovascular diseases? Can you share a bit about how you got started in the field and the obstacles that you encountered along the way?
Somehow, I very early had an interest in atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease, and also cerebrovascular disease, neurological disorders. It just spoke to me during med school. So I early on, contacted senior scientists within, that was especially within neurological diseases, stroke diseases, and made some I think it was a bachelor thesis within that field. And then by that, I met other people and continued to do research during med school. Not that was very successful, but, I got started. So that was an urge for me to pursue that area also, and not only being in the teaching, taking the teaching. That was quite, as it is in med school, very intense. But that, I think, it energized me to do all the courses also. So that was early. So just after, actually some months before starting clinical training, after graduating, I started a fellowship, and that got me started into the path that I have, you could say, followed after that. So it was a genuine interest from the beginning, and I must say, it most often never fails if you have a genuine interest in a field. So when young people come to me and ask for advice, I always ask them, what do you really think is interesting in biology, in human genetics, in the different disease areas? And then you can see where the energy comes out of their faces, and that is probably the area you should advise that young people to go in the direction of. Yeah.
That's actually really fascinating. We all have our favorites, right?
Yeah.
Did you always envision yourself as a clinical scientist, or did that passion for research develop as you went through your academic training? Also, were there any gender-related barriers you encountered in your career that shaped your journey?
I would say what I alluded to before, this genuine interest for atherosclerosis and cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease came early to me. And then I was very lucky to be oriented towards a project that later on became my PhD project on actually many years ago on the ApoE gene that stands very central for lipid metabolism, as we know, stands very central through lipid metabolism for cardiovascular disease and athero, but also really stands central for cerebrovascular disease and indeed dementia. And ApoE is also a very good example of complex common genetics. So before we really had the resources we have now in genomic consortia and so on, ApoE, I was trained in ApoE and had a sincere interest in understanding those complex interactions between ApoE-related lipid metabolism, gene environment interactions, and also after my PhD really thought people who had that angle to it abroad. So that also kind of formed me in the focus I've had as being an independent researcher and in my professorship to really bridge cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative disease. There is so much in common, and there are also really distinct features, but where our general understanding of complex genetics and lipid metabolism can help us to understand local and shared features. So that has been a very important and fulfilling journey for me to, have that instinct. I don't know where it came from, but that was, of course, fueled by my surroundings and so on. That now it's important. I can see in many ways how we study the intersections not only between cardiovascular disease and dementia and neurodegenerative diseases, but also atherosclerosis, ASCVD, and other common diseases. So that has been a very important journey for me. And challenges during my career and advancements and so on, I would say, of course, there have been gender barriers in my career. Of course, there has been. But I suppose I have been a little bit blind towards that because I've been so focused on my scientific aim and the scientific interest that I think I have been a little bit blind. But as I have become taking on leadership roles, especially at the university, I have become very, very aware and of how important it is that we take this task on us. And I use a lot of time whenever I'm asked about advice about academic positions and in scientific councils and so on, of course, to always ensure a gender balance. So it's so good, and I'm so thankful that for those pioneers who really put it on the agenda, which I hope I can say that I supported very early. So it's very important for us all at the different career levels we are, regardless of our gender, to of course secure this equality. Not only gender-wise, of course, but in many other aspects. I think one very, very important aspect for all of us is, of course, to ensure all ethnicities. We have cultural barriers, ancestry barriers, and we really need to get going there. And that is both for careers, it's certainly also for our research resources.
Thank you so much for that insight. We really value your thoughts on this matter. Mentorship is often a crucial part of any successful career. Were there any mentors who significantly influenced your path and guided you throughout your academic journey?
I have been so fortunate to very early in my life to meet the very best. So when I think I was 25 or 24 when I met Professor Anne Thybier Hansen, and we started working together. And she was my primary PhD supervisor. And then a little later on, Professor Børge Nordesgaard came on, and he was also one of my PhD supervisors. And we got it going with my PhD on ApoE. And then after the PhD thesis, I contacted Professor Charles Singh, who is a PhD or was a PhD in complex genetics at the Department of Human Genetics at University of Michigan. And I had my postdocs. I did it back and forth, some months over there, some months back home. So I could also start my clinical training as a specialist in clinical biochemistry. So it was a mixture of a postdoc abroad and back, and at the same time doing the clinical training. And of course, a very nice basis from working with Anne and Borg in the PhD period, and also then going at a time where big cohorts was really difficult to work with. So bringing, collaborating with Professor Singh on our Copenhagen data was really a huge win-win for both his group and the group I was in, and really fueled my interest in complex lipid genetics. At that time point, Professor Singh led the first resequencing project that was very, very exotic, to have more than one person to sequence for several genes. And he, while I was there, I think it was at that time, he and his group actually published in Nature Genetics the first resequencing of lipoprotein lipase in 48 individuals. And that showed that there is common genetic variation in lipoprotein lipase. So that you can see how fast things has really happened. At that time point, we were also very fortunate if we could get the full sequence of an entire gene, so we could, do research and make our primers for our studies. So much has happened since this, but it was at a very important time for me to get the exposure towards these emerging genomic technologies, and that after that just has accelerated, of course, in pace. So very good for me, or very inspiring for me, to have the combination of working with Anne and Borg here in Copenhagen on the Copenhagen City Heart Study at that time point, where we worked with 10,000 individuals and had specific genetic variants, and then to work with Professor Singh and his environment there, where they started, the more large-scale sequencing projects. And here we are talking in what was that? That was in late 90s. So a lot of things were paving the way for the future genomic consortia that we're working with now. So they played a tremendous role for me.
It's quite clear that mentorship played a very important role in your success. Before we move on, could you tell us about any exciting new projects or research directions your lab is pursuing?
Yeah. I'll do it short here. But the exciting, I think, in my view, projects that we are really trying to fuel and expand right now is this intersection between cardiovascular disease, lipid metabolism, and dementia. That's one aspect. And why is that important? That's very important to decipher and to make the causal evidence for which of the cardiovascular risk factors that are really a cause of dementia. Because we do not have drug yet for treating dementia. As you know, it's a ticking bomb under our societies. We are aging. Every fourth person above the age of 84 has a dementia diagnosis, and we cannot treat it. And we live longer. because we survive our cardiac diseases now because we are well treated and become aged, and then many of us will get a dementia diagnosis. So we want to develop and create the scientific evidence for the causality of the cardiovascular risk factors. We have a series of papers published and out now for review, where we take all the modifiable risk factors that have just been stated and updated in a Lancet Commission report, and scrutinize each of them with genomic consortia behind each exposure, so we can make causal inference for how they associate in a causal manner with later development of dementia. And specifically now, of interest for this society, of course, we have just recently shown, it's out for review and it's out in a preprint on a preprint server, that for the first time we actually have some kind of causal proof for LDL cholesterol and also triglyceride-rich lipoproteins as a cause of future dementia. It's logical for us as athero researchers, but the causal proof has not been there. And that opens up for now that we really can say what is healthy, for what is good for the heart is good for the brain, and really, in my view, makes the evidence or the base for an efficient, early, and ambitious prevention policy for dementia also. There are many efforts out there, in different dementia associations to make these brain health campaigns, but we're lacking behind cardiovascular disease. So we really need to create all the causal evidence we can, and then to try to make policies and help the neurological dementia world to get good evidence for prevention strategies. So that's a major area in my research group, building all the genomic or using all the genomic evidence we have there to do that. And another very important area is our work with the Copenhagen Baby Heart Study. We want to decipher lipid metabolism in early childhood and the influential factors on that. As you know, we have descriptive data out here some years ago that has been presented and published in European Heart Journal and presented here several times. And now we're pursuing that line to scrutinize all the maternal risk factors for lipid metabolism in the child, and to see how we can create more evidence also to advise early prevention in coming mothers. So I would say that's two major areas that we are working intensively within my group.
That's truly intriguing. Congratulations on all the great work. Given your findings, do you think targeting lipoproteins or lipid metabolism could offer a viable therapeutic approach for dementia in the future?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. We just talked earlier about the preventive potential, which is very important with creating the scientific or causal evidence for the background of efficient prevention. When we talk about treating dementia, that's another issue, because it's very difficult because, for dementia, there is a huge and long prodromal phases before you get the overt diagnosis. There is, slight and progressive cognitive impairment, but people have different cognitive potential initially. So it's very difficult to see or to predict when is it you really, deteriorate it. And that's first there you get the diagnosis. So the prodromal phases is really a phase where you often lose appetite, actually because of the declining cognition. It affects your olfactory function. So you lose appetite, then you lose weight, then your blood pressure goes down, your lipids often goes down before you have the overt diagnosis. So you can see how that situation also is a major bias in observational studies, because sometimes you actually get counterintuitive results when you just do cross-sectional studies because of this prodromal phases that is kind of reverse causation. So you could say when people have dementia, what is it you should treat? Often they have lower blood pressure. Often they have lower cholesterol. So you can't follow that path. So that's a bit tricky. And the medications that have been tested for treatment of dementia is, the amyloid hypothesis and trying to deal with removing amyloid plaques. That has been very, very tricky. There are some now approved medicines. They are not candy, we can say. There are severe side effects. They are now approved with danger signals from the FDA. They are also approved in some countries in Europe. EMA has approved it, but also with danger signals and lots of follow-up if patients are given these medications. So it's not a cure for all. It will perhaps be a drug that can, in some cases, improve the prognosis, but it will probably not be a wonder drug. So what is going on now in the treatment field is that there is a trial now, EVOKE and EVOKE Plus from Novo Nordisk on semaglutide, where we expect the results in 26. So it's more improving you could say, general metabolic shape in the brain. We are eagerly awaiting those results. I'm sure it's also complicated. And what the endpoint is some kind of cognitive tests, because of course we can't wait for many years until an overt dementia diagnosis is happening. It would be fantastic if there are positive results. We will have to wait for that. What was interesting when designing these studies is that EVOKE is early Alzheimer's, and then EVOKE Plus is where also patients with vascular components are included, if I understand the protocols correctly. But we are waiting for those results in early next year, I hope. But that also reinforces that preventive measures now early at the population level is really, really important.
Well, we wish you all the luck with those results. Exciting times ahead. One of your recent papers explored the connection between neutrophil counts and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. What comes next in this line of research? Do you see neutrophils as potential therapeutic targets? And are there specific mechanisms, such as neutrophil activation or degranulation, that could explain the connection to atherosclerosis?
Very important question. Thank you very much. Yes, it has been a very interesting and rewarding area when we went into this inflammation field, especially focusing on white blood cell counts. And we saw this very, very clear causes signal for neutrophils that we published some years ago. And it was very interesting for us to see how the response from the basic science field was, because in basic science in these areas, they have had the causal evidence for the neutrophil signal for ages, but the human signal really was missing. And there are many reasons for that. But now we deciphered, especially Jiao Lu, postdoc Jiao Lu, who is also an EAS Young Fellow. She deciphered based on some very complex blood cell consortium data, deciphered very, very nice genomic instruments for each of the leukocyte subtypes, and that enabled us to address robustly this question. And we got a very clear signal on the neutrophil count. Of course, it's not probably the neutrophil in itself, but there are underlying reasons. And that is exactly what we are scrutinizing now. We were so lucky to be able to explore some unique resources we have in Copenhagen from the Copenhagen Hospital Biobank. We have GWASs and a lot of phenotypic and inflammatory phenotypes on these individuals. And Jiaolu and I are now scrutinizing cytokine pathways. Jiao is creating genomic instruments for each of these cytokines, and then we will go from there. And I envision that we will find some of the underlying reasons for our neutrophil causal signal. There are also very nice opportunities in the UK Biobank with the proteomics data and some cytokine information there. So we will do our best to scrutinize that. It's very complex data. But I have high hopes for that. So I cannot give you a final answer on that now, but I'm sure that Jiaolu and I will have some answers in the coming years.
Hope all goes well with that research as well. Your work has also involved major cohort studies and large-scale population biobanks, which are pivotal for advancing cardiovascular research. How do you see the future of these biobanks evolving? With AI and new technological tools rapidly advancing, what new opportunities do you foresee for cardiovascular research in the coming years?
Yeah, this is pivotal for our research to flourish. There's no doubt about that. There's so many opportunities, and my motto now is definitely collaborate, 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 because there are so many opportunities now, and we cannot do everything ourselves, and we shouldn't. It will only make our research less robust. So I'm fortunate to, of course, work with these fantastic resources in Copenhagen, but also several very fruitful international consortia. And there are, of course, the biobanks and the consortia we all know. I have very good collaborators in the FINGEN study. Of course, we work with the UK Biobank. And then a very close and of enormous importance for me, a collaboration is my collaboration with the largest Alzheimer's consortium, the European Alzheimer's and Dementia Biobank, headed by INSERM Director Jean-Charles Lambert, and I'm in the steering committee there. And what we are bridging there now is, first of all, multi-ancestry GWAS studies, very important, and then also bridging this, you could say, much of the GWAS studies now are based on summary level data, but also now expanding it to have nodes across the globe to do individual data analysis and then go together. That's how we will expand. And that is also a requirement for applying AI methods that we are doing also. Because, of course, there are strategies for doing it on summarized data also, but to really explore and unfold the full potential of that, you have to sit exactly with individual level data. Of course, there's a huge legislation area and so on in that, but we gather together across the globe to talk about how we evolve that field. There is an area within what is called federated learning, where you, in secure manners, can access individual level data on site from externally. And of course, that has to be a super high level of security, because often you go in and use healthcare data. So that's, of course, a discipline in itself, but I see that really as an important area for us to evolve. And we have unique opportunities in cardiovascular disease because the phenotypes and genetics is in comparison to other areas really advanced. Another thing that is very important for us to be able to implement new technologies, AI and so on, is that we are aware of our responsibility for validation of AI methods, just as stringently as we test new medicines. We need to test if we want to apply AI in prediction models and so on. We need to test them against state of the art. And that will be a major discipline, I think. But we need to take the responsibility to do that.
Yeah, it's definitely an evolving discipline, as you said. I agree. As we near the end of our conversation, we have a section that we like to call the graveyard of ideas. This is where we acknowledge that failure is an important part of the scientific process, even though it's not often discussed. Could you share an example of an idea, project, or grant that didn't go as planned and what you learned from the experience?
Oh, I have many failures, many failures. I think some of the best grant applications I have ever made, I've been so proud of, they never got funded. Some of the best grant applications with respect to international collaborations, they never got granted. And then somehow we figured out to do the most important research projects anyhow. But that's, of course, extremely irritating when you, for instance, reach to through the first step of an application, but don't make it to the final round. But that's, of course, the name of the game. We all know that. But you could say that's a little bit of a graveyard. But anyhow, in the process of writing an ambitious grant proposal, and often with international collaborators, even though you don't get through, I mean, that has always energized me, because in that process, you really get new ideas, get your own ideas a little bit under pressure, and get them improved. So that's actually a good graveyard for those applications who never made it. And of course, there are numerous research projects that didn't, make the way. I don't think I should mention them all. I would say one, though, because there are, when it was perhaps too early to start in my postdoc period, really to have ambitions about really studying complex genetics and gene-environment interactions. And I did that together with Professor Siggen at UMich. The results were really not convincing. We had a few papers especially focusing on these gene-environment interactions in lipid metabolism. I think that the strategy was really well thought through, but the power in it was really not able to, that we could answer those questions sufficiently. So that was immature at that point. But anyhow, I can just see that the way we thought about it at that time point is actually very useful now. For what we do, especially in the Alzheimer's Consortium, we just now actually, it has been accepted a machine learning interaction paper, because we now have the techniques and we have the power in the genomic information. And I am actually using the thoughts from my postdoc time, because it's very centered about ApoE. You have to think very clear about ApoE when you do dementia research, because it is extremely important in dementia. We know that as a risk factor. So whatever you do in gene-gene interaction and gene-environment interaction studies, I actually use my discussions from way back at UMich now in our discussions in the consortium. So yeah, at that time point, a little bit of a graveyard, but then, rising up again and being of use. So it's in some way, these failures, not all of them, but some of them are very useful for training your thinking.
reborn from the ashes then.
A little bit, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's such an important reminder for all of us that failure is a stepping stone to success. Before we wrap up, one last practical question. How do you usually announce open positions in your lab? Would you encourage young researchers to reach out directly to the labs that they're interested in, or do you rely on formal job postings? How does this process work at your institution?
Of course, you can do both, but for sure, reach out. The personal communication is so important. And I must say the last several years, most of those students, both pre-graduate students, postgraduate students, and senior scientists, that has been through personal communication. It's not that I don't, like the official sites. I've done that now and then, but reach out. I always, if I am contacted by a young scientist, I am always taking a first physical or virtual meeting to get the conversation started, and not only to see if this is a right match, but also to quickly aid the person in redirecting the person. If I listen to the interests of this young scientist, I can direct the person to the right persons, or I can take a second meeting with the person. So what I usually do is, first, I get a contact. I invite them to a physical meeting if it's in Denmark. We have, less than an hour meeting, and then we see if this could be a potential match. And if so, and the area of interest is in my field, I take a second meeting together with my senior scientists and postdocs, typically 3, and we have a meeting, all the 4 to 5 of us, and still do not promise anything. And then we talk about whether this is a match. And then after that, we of course have to talk about funding and so on, and what the opportunities are. And I think that has served as a viable, you could say, way of doing it for me and for my group. So reach out, and then I will be happy to take a meeting, and quickly also perhaps to redirect the person.
Thank you so much, Professor Brücke-Schmidt, for sharing your time, insights, and experiences with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
It's truly on my side. Thank you so much.
To all our listeners, thank you for joining us on another episode of AtheroTalk. If you enjoyed today's discussion, we'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your colleagues. We're always open to your feedback, so feel free to let us know what topics you'd like to hear more of in the future. And once again, thank you so much, Professor Brücke-Schmidt.
You're so welcome.